Thanks for tuning in, y'all. Today is Monday, April 27, 2026. My name is Luther, real estate extraordinaire here in the Kansas City market. For those that don't know, I'm a real estate broker for Kansas and Missouri, also a real estate investor, and most everything that I do is around or based on residential investments that are purchased, frequently, a lot of the times renovated, okay? A lot of times there's a refi, and then we can get to it. Most of everything that we do is buy and hold long-term, investments with the use of seller financing, all right? So I have been taking a deeper dive into real estate investment operations, and most recently, how operators, those investors who are the boots on the ground, right, can get themselves compensated for the services and the work that they were doing. I was just telling my dad before he clicked the record button what my fee was, right? And the things that I would have to do with a client. In this case, it was an investor who wanted to buy a property in the Kansas City market. The investor's out of state. There's a lot of things that, goes into making that happen, all right? So let's jump right in. The topic of today is part 3 of getting compensated. Real estate operators, real estate investment operators, the boots on the ground. If you're a general partner, you own the investments, or maybe you're a third party helping investors through the process. How can you get compensated through that process so you don't necessarily have to wait until the back end to get paid? Because as I mentioned before, sometimes there is no back end for a real estate investment. It is what it is. Sometimes investments lose money. Sometimes rentals or holdings don't cash flow. So if you're going to wait to the back end, there's a lot of time and energy and effort that you may, or someone on your team may have to put up and to make this thing happen. Okay, so in order to better determine how you might be able to compensate yourself if you're in that role, or if you're partnered with someone in that role, or maybe you're outsourcing a certain way, in order to determine how you can make that happen more efficiently, first off, you got to have capital. Then you got to have a good strategy. You got to know what your strategy is. And then you got to understand the exchange points. Where are the key areas where service is being provided and money's being exchanged? And I talked about that on the last couple videos. In today's video, I'm going to get more into how I've made that happen. Some of the models that I've utilized, right? Some of my mentors who I look up to and have learned from. And then some of the numbers, the actual amounts that I've charged, okay? So, before I get rolling, shout out to my pops. He's been in the game 35 years. Shout out to Richard Powelson, okay? He was one of my father's mentors. Shout out to Jed Howe. He was one of my dad's first business partners in real estate. And also shout out to John Burley, okay? These are some of the guys that I have met along the way, and whose models or investment strategies I've used successfully, okay? So early on in the game, I'm trying to figure out investing. It's between 2008 and 2011. I had no money, right? I'm trying to figure out how I can get experience. And one of the first things that I learned was about creative financing and private mortgages or notes, okay? So my thought, or my objective was, okay, if I can get into an investment property and take over the existing financing, subject to, right? And then from there, I could turn around and do seller financing in the form of some type of installment agreement. That was my number one objective. And I basically tried that for, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, didn't have much luck with it, but I eventually did buy my primary residence subject to the existing financing, stayed there for 1.5 years, moved out, back in with my parents, and then I turned that into an investment property. And we did indeed do an installment agreement in the form of a contract for deed. We held it for 10 years, cash flowed, the investor, refinanced after that 10-year mark. And my father and I walked away with a large, healthy 5-figure payday. But I had to wait 10 years. You see what I'm saying? And it didn't bother me so much because I lived in the home. I had roommates during that time, and the thing performed. But I learned some valuable lessons, right? If I wanted to do that over and over and over again, and I was using other people's money, I would have needed to figure out how to place that capital effectively and then how to pay myself to get through that process, as I mentioned before. So that's a great strategy. It's a pretty neat model, getting in creatively with some type of seller financing, right? Then on the back end, doing some type of seller financing. The key part, the point of this message today is like, okay, you may not be able to pay yourself, unfortunately, to get through that process unless you're doing multiples of them and you're using other people's money, and you break it down to them as their partner, the GP, you're part owner of these investments, of those businesses. You break it down to them and say, hey, here's my fee. Then you can go from there. All right. So that's one investment strategy or model that, I've used time and time again with partners, with clients, and so forth. To be clear, like that is hard to repeat and grow and scale, okay? Which is why I started to adopt some other investment models, okay? One of which is the BRRRR strategy, right? A lot of y'all listening are familiar with that. You buy the thing, you renovate it, you refinance, repeat, right? Rent it in the middle of one of those R's, right? And then you repeat it. That seems to be one of the most common strategies or models that investors utilize. I've utilized a number of times, again, with partners and clients, but it can get very challenging as the market shifts and things that are out of our control change, right? Which we experienced not only with COVID 2020 through 2022, which we were able to take advantage of in a lot of ways, but then things changed. 2022, 2023, interest rates went up. And as that happened, I was wrapping up I was wrapping up projects and investments again with partners and clients, and the writing was on the wall. And I said, hey, I think the party's over, guys. What we had done from 2020 through 2022 is going to be harder to repeat. So I said, hey, let's pump the brakes. Like, hey, let's go back to the drawing board. And it was at that point when I started to realize, like, hey, I need to not only go back to the drawing board and figure out maybe another strategy, but I also need to figure out how I can get paid more efficiently to go through this process, because there was a 6-year span with one of my partners where I did not pay myself and I was investing money. At certain points, we would, let me rephrase that. I didn't pay myself consistently. During a 6-year span, we were doing deals, buying, renovating, refinancing, doing seller financing, doing wholesale, doing direct to seller marketing campaigns, doing wholesale deals, buying rentals. I was overseeing all of that, and the list goes on, right? So during that 6-year span, I only paid myself 5 times, and it got to be overwhelming, because again, 2022, 2023, things started to change, and I was like, all right. So it was a few years ago, around that time, when I heard about John Burley. And I had heard about him on a podcast. I was driving around for Uber. By the way, I still drive for Uber to this day, okay? And I was listening to the Real Estate Disruptors podcast with Steve Trang. He had interviewed John Burley, and I was like, holy smokes, these guys are onto something. All right, I like the sound of that model, okay? Because I was struggling to figure out how to make things happen and continue investing and growing our portfolio, because me and my partners at the time were pretty much tapped out on capital. We had a success, we had a track record, we had investments that were performing, we were making profits, but I was wanting to keep going, right? But I wanted to get paid, but my investors and we ran out of money. So I was like, okay, cool, I got to figure out something different. So I went to a couple of John Burley's events, really liked that model, and his model is quite a bit different, and it definitely goes against the grain from what most investors are taught one of the first things he'll tell you is that you need money. And then they teach you how to raise money, okay? And then the other thing is when you place capital, you pay yourself as an operator. That's when it really sunk in for me. Like, and then at that point, right, I had learned some lessons, and on the next investment that I did, to get into some of the numbers, as I said I would do, my partner paid me 10 grand, okay? So we had started an LLC, right? I opened up the business bank account. My business partner put money into the business bank account. We got pre-approved with our lender. Then I started looking for product. Then I found an opportunity. Then when we closed on it, okay, at the closing, we bought the property. Part of the fees was the 10 grand fee that went to me as the operator, okay? Then we proceeded to renovate the property, right? Then we refinanced, right? Then we did seller financing. Guess how long that whole process took? Took almost a year, okay? So I'm hoping that this will clear up some stuff about the realities of real estate investing and encourage some of the investors to, not be afraid to switch things up when necessary, but also not be afraid to get yourself paid, whether it's up front, okay? Whether it's at closing, right? Whether it's at time of renovation, okay? Or at time of refi, right? Somehow, hopefully one of those first two, right? Hopefully when you get money from an investor, you get paid to place that money. And then if not there, hopefully you're getting paid quite a substantial amount when you acquire the property. Because again, some of these projects took 2-3 months, meaning like from start to finish, we bought the property, did whatever we did, then sold it or rented. And some of them, again, took almost a year. I had 2 other ones that I did with a different business partner, each of which took about a year because we bought the property when there was tenants in there. We bought them from a tired landlord. We did our direct to seller marketing campaigns, right? As a lot of us are taught. We found really great opportunities, but I didn't think at that point, that was prior to meeting John Burley and going to his 2 events. And that was prior to working with the second business partner that I mentioned. I had already been rocking with the previous investment partner for about 2-3 years. So it would have been a little bit more challenging for me to go back to my initial partner and say, hey, I know you haven't really been paying me up to this point, but I'd like to get paid. I tried it, didn't really work. Go figure. Now we don't work together. Imagine that. So the whole point, right? The models, right? Buying creatively, selling creatively. Okay, cool. Right? And by the way, I haven't gotten into wholesale or fix and flip, which we've done all of that. But again, my focus primarily is on the buy and hold, which is why I'm talking about primarily, okay, the methods, the models, the strategies for that. Okay, I mentioned buying creatively, then selling creatively, right? Then I mentioned the BRRRR strategy. Okay, what I want to mention next regarding John Burley and his method, they go turnkey, which again goes against the grain, right? They're going straight into single family home investments that are livable or turnkey, right? They are going immediately into long-term financing for that investment. And they're doing a non-QM funding, non-QM mortgage, non-qualified mortgage, not necessarily DSCR, which I know a lot of investors are obsessed with that too, but they're going straight into a 3-bed, 2-bath, single family home in a B-class area, right? And they're gonna put 20 to 30% down. And then from there, they do lease option. And when they get money on the front end from their investors, right? It's 10 grand per house. Okay, cool, right? Right, so I hope this makes sense. I wanna briefly touch on the real estate investor concierge program, because when I did that, I was serving other investors. Everything that I've mentioned up to this point is if I actually am partnering with investors and I own that investment, right? Either way you shake it, okay? Whether you're in on the deal or you are serving investors, right? And you're just third party, you don't own those investments, you need to figure out how to get yourself paid. Okay, I brought up the Real Estate Investor Concierge Program, and as I promised, I want to talk about some of the numbers that I charge for that. And some of y'all, can use it, right? When I did the Real Estate Investor Concierge Program, for the first 4 clients, I charged $3,000 up front, right? For the 5th client, I charged $5,000 up front. And would you imagine, right? Of all of the dozens of investors that I had worked with from basically 2011 through 2022, when I started the Real Estate Investor Concierge Program, I'd probably worked with close to 100 investors between 2011 and 2022. A lot of them flaked out. Some of them I couldn't help. A handful of them I was able to help with acquisitions or resales. But lo and behold, when I started to realize how valuable these services are and believed in myself more, and I started charging accordingly, every single investor that I took through that program succeeded with at least one investment. Okay, so the proof is in the pudding. Hopefully, again, this will encourage y'all. Stay focused, stay in the game, y'all. It's hard out here, but let's keep going. Appreciate you tuning in. On a future episode, I'm gonna, as I agreed to, talk more about general partnerships and limited partnerships and how we can incorporate some of the good stuff that the commercial and multifamily investment operators use and how we can use that for single family home investments. And by the way, it kind of ties in with what I mentioned about the Burley model. There's a couple other points that I wanted to make about the Real Estate Investor Concierge Program. I mentioned charging the upfront fee. The first few clients, it was $3,000, right? Then the last client I took through that process, it was $5,000. Okay, to clear things up and take things a little bit further, I also charged renovation management, AKA project management fees. Okay, I don't want to forget about that because there's a lot of investors who are taking on renovations, right? And they're doing it third party for other investors. And a lot of times it's not real clear how they're charging them. How I did it, okay? I charged a percentage. I charged 10% of the overall renovation cost. And I waited till the renovation was done on that. Okay, so I felt comfortable doing that as part of my Real Estate Investor Concierge Program because, again, I charged them an upfront fee. So that gave me some breathing room because when I took them through this process, as I mentioned before, am on site at least once a week at every property that's vacant. And I'm helping either a partner through that process or I'm helping a client through that process. So I got the upfront fee. I charged a renovation management fee of 10%. And I waited till the tail end. So if that renovation came out to be $40,000 materials and labor, my management fee was $4,000. If that renovation, when it's all said and done, the labor and the materials came out to be $50,000, my renovation or project management fee was 10% of that, $5,000. Okay. And then from there, right? Okay. I charged even more, right? As you can imagine, I was pretty fired up at this point. On the resale, right? However we sold the property, right? Whether we sold it seller carryback or we sold it on the open market, which was very few because again, most of what we do is buy and hold, but I charged a commission for that. Okay. And at that point I was doing property management. So I did give them a little bit of a break on the property management fees if they held the property as rentals, but most of them did seller financing. So I wanted to add those few extra tidbits on there about the Real Estate Investor Concierge Program, about how I was able to help investors third party. I was not in on those deals. I did not own those deals, but every investor that I took through that process saw success. Okay, so wanted to add that in there. Again, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this will, bring some clarity on how you can get in and stay in and not burn yourself out and not burn your team out either. So you can keep going. But again, a lot of it, so much I talk about, it comes back to the capital, the strategy and the operations. All right, so that's it. Take care, y'all. Peace.